Welcome to Berlin, and Roberto, thank you for bringing Frontiers back to Berlin. Berlin, I live here, is an amazing city. We are really good in breaking walls. That's why I started my open source foundation here in Berlin. But Berlin is also a place to meet people. And I have little children. I'm an early adopter on technology and a late adopter on family planning. And I was sitting with my baseball cap where there was written on it, "Make AI open again," a red baseball cap, you know the analogy. And then Jakob approached me because we have children of the same age, and we actually met at the playground. And this is where we always meet. So today's conversation is a continuation of that playground conversation. Jakob was 15 years at Google. He has, now we can say he worked with and for Nobel Prize laureates, because Geoffrey Hinton and Demis Hassabis, from the founder of DeepMind, just received a Nobel Prize. And he was very substantial on things we use daily. So I think he's very modest, but it's fair to say that he was one of the biggest contributors at the beginning to build Google Translate. Then he created, as well with his colleagues, the T in GPT, the Transformer Model Architecture. And then now he was able to raise over 100 million with NVIDIA and with Andreessen Horowitz to build his new biotech venture. So he has been very impactful in his life in this very young age. And looking back before we start into his new biotech venture, because that T in ChatGPT is influencing each of us. I wanted to start with a personal question, because that paper that Roberto mentioned has over 137,000 citations. Attention is all you need, and really impacted the whole world. I don't know anybody in my private life who has such an impact on millions or billions of people. So my first question would be a very personal one, Jakob. Is like, when you published that paper 7 years ago, were you expecting this to happen, and how do you feel now seeing the impact what these GPT models are doing in our world?
Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, as the Berliners would say, Tag. Let's see where to start. And maybe just touching briefly on what the previous panel was talking about, the power of local communities in many of these cases. It was an amazing opportunity to have met you on the playground. How do I feel now? And did we expect this? We certainly had high hopes for the impact of the technology that we're proposing in that paper to affect AI, or deep learning, as we thought of back then. We certainly didn't expect that to then, in hindsight, be regarded as the inclination point that took deep learning from something that, yes, was very promising and really changed computer science at the time, to something that we now look back at as a technology that is really in the very middle of changing the world. That's what it might seem like. I think it's actually only in the very beginning of really having its effect. Now, I should also preface the rest of the answer with the fact that people in general really like to see developments as revolutions, as instants in time that suddenly changed everything, when the truth is that revolutions basically never happen. What really happens is years and years of very hard work by lots of people, most heroes unsung, that you build on, the giants whose shoulders you stand on at the end of the day. And this paper that we published really was the culmination of many years of work of a fairly large team that I was leading at times at Google. And it's really maybe the storytelling that we prefer that makes it look like this kind of inclination point, or this spark that ignited some revolution. Now that said, the response to that being seen widely as such a spark, as such a game changer, is, of course, first of all, very humbling, but then I would also say an incredible opportunity. And contrary to comic book heroes who see great responsibility in great power, I actually think that it is great responsibility that comes from amazing opportunities. And so the opportunities that for me personally have opened up as a result of this, right? Meeting amazing people like all of you and getting to speak in front of them, to folks like you.
Finding 100 million in venture capital.
Raising 100 plus million in venture capital, really I think are in a certain sense, or create a moral imperative, if you wish, to then try to actually make the best of that. And so really what happened as a result was that 3 events in rapid succession happened: the birth of my first child, who was partially responsible for introducing us. Then very quickly after that, that was during the pandemic, very quickly after that, the CASP-14 results were announced. And that was, CASP-14 was the CASP round in which AlphaFold 2 really wiped the table with everything, right? AlphaFold 1 showed, yes, deep learning is ready for prime time in structural molecular biology. AlphaFold 2 said, no, that version of the problem is over after 50 years of trying. And AlphaFold 2 is based to a large extent, or the delta between AlphaFold 1 and 2 is based to a large extent on the transformer and other deep learning work that I was involved with. And then the third event that happened, all in a total of maybe 2.5 months, was that the first efficacy results, large scale, from the mRNA COVID vaccines came about. And at that stage, somebody really wise came to me and said, if your daughter 10 years from now will learn that you had the opportunity to raise money in order to be able to apply this technology like AlphaFold 2 to RNA design, which we couldn't at the time because no data existed and was treated as a neglected stepchild. If 10 years later your daughter might learn that you didn't do it because you wanted to keep your golden handcuffs at Google, then maybe you didn't actually take the responsibility that comes from these opportunities seriously. And that was, the end of my cushy dream job at Google and the beginning of this journey as an entrepreneur. But I think that maybe sums it up, right? I think really it's a responsibility and an imperative to act on these opportunities.
It's funny because I have the same feeling when my children were born. I wanted to open source for their future. Now, I've been using these large language models that have been trained on software code. And recently I spent the weekend using Cursor AI and Versal. And I could prompt in just 2 days. It was been 15 years since I coded. I could prompt an app that functioned. Now, what actually happened is that in programming now, we have a new abstraction layer where we can use human natural language in order to create software code. Now, jumping now to your startup and your biotech, Inceptive, is that similar what you are doing? Like, are you creating a new abstraction layer for biology? Because I heard a talk at EPFL in Lausanne 2 years ago from you, where you talked about bioprology and creating the language of biology. Can you share that with the audience, what your goals are, what your vision is with Inceptive and where you're heading to?
So the very long-term vision, very much long-term vision, is actually, it revolves exactly around this idea of maybe not creating an abstraction layer akin to how English, or German for that matter, is replacing programming languages in actually writing programs that will be compiled into computer code that then runs on computer hardware, but actually on the other end of that process, where we don't know yet what the inputs will be. They will probably look like initially some programming languages, but the outputs will be something very much akin to pieces of software, but those will be pieces of software not running on computers, but pieces of software running on organisms. Initially, individual cells, or maybe even organelles in cells, if you want to look at it that way. Now, the problem is that, we've all heard phrases like programmable medicines thrown around, et cetera, ad nausea. The problem is that if we approach this problem of generating not just programmable medicines, but programmed medicines, medicines that are assembled from modular building blocks that can be reusable across individual products, indications, programs, et cetera, if we try to do that with traditional techniques akin to how we would build a compiler for programming languages, we're absolutely bound to fail. And the reason we're bound to fail is because life hasn't evolved, why would it, in a way that is as mechanistic as, say, elegantly human designed as our computers are trying to be. quite the opposite, right? Interaction patterns in this phenomenon of life between all the different countless players that we still don't have all inventorized are completely chaotic and dense. We think of a protein as a ribosomal protein, sure, but then we find out it moonlights in 50 other jobs, and we have no idea about what half of them really, in quotes, are for, because even this notion of function, if you look at this phenomenon of life, is actually probably at least a suboptimal metaphor to think about, right? So how could we ever put together this kind of modular, or how could we build design drugs, design medicines in a modular way? Well, maybe we can learn a compiler. Maybe we can learn through applying very large-scale deep learning to rich and multi-scale observations of this phenomenon life. Maybe we can learn something that takes some specification and turns that into molecules, right? And the place where we're starting, humble beginnings, is mRNA or RNA, where maybe such a biological program could be something along the lines of, take the following amino acid sequence, and in cells in this tissue, roughly there in the cell, with the following envelope or kinetics over time, express this and that much of that specific protein. And maybe we can then learn a model from observing individual cells at first, and maybe also later with in vivo observations, that takes such a program and spits out an RNA sequence that you can then go synthesize, and once introduced into the respective cells, actually exhibits or executes the functions or the behaviors that you specified. And when it comes to mRNA, and highly relevant, therapeutically relevant properties such as protein expression, kinetics, et cetera, this is actually something that is starting to work. Now, we don't want to stop there. We're certainly not just around mRNA, but we do see nucleic acids in their broad applicability across indications, across what pharma usually calls modalities, as the ideal initial stepping stone on that direction. And one of the reasons for that is it's comparatively easy and cheap to synthesize at scale. Mm-hmm. That in turn enables data collection. All the genomic data that we have publicly available and not just isn't enough. We need to create orders of magnitude more data on top of that. But then also, it really does appear to be a broadly applicable platform with increasingly and very quickly commoditized infrastructure for manufacturing and delivery.
Okay, well, I hope everybody understood everything. But going back to the in vitro tests that you do, yes. So you're creating a lot of training data at the end. So, and my favorite topic is open data.
Yes.
And so how do you see that what you are doing and the need for data? You're creating your proprietary data that you have out of your in vitro test, mm-hmm. but you need other data. And you mentioned as well AlphaFold, which actually, when you look at why Demis Hassabis got the Nobel Prize, I called it the Nobel Prize for open data, because without open data, I would never got that Nobel Prize. So how do you see the need for open data sets to accelerate actually that promising work you're doing?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, we dramatically underestimate the potential value that would come from sharing data across many, many different areas in health and life sciences. And why do we underestimate it massively? Because we don't even know that everybody reinvents the same things over and over again, because we don't even know what types of data exist somewhere else. And that ultimately is bad, not only for the pace and the velocity at which companies like Inceptive, but also big pharmas are able to move, it's also terrible for society. Because society is paying, directly or indirectly, for reinventing the same wheel n times. Right? And so what we've seen in tech, to contrast this with in the last 20 to 30 years, is that because of open source software, that has largely stopped. Nobody anymore believes that it's a good idea to just build something and try not to show it to anybody and keep it to yourself, because guess what? They can build the same thing. And now everybody's actually worse off. Instead, once you've figured out what a common building block is, release it so that you don't have to put up with the maintenance anymore by yourself. And if everybody does that, that's good for everybody. So the whole thing turns from a protective, basically game of, protectionism ultimately around area into a race. And that race produces innovation at such an increased pace that ultimately it's not only good for value creation from the perspective of each individual player in there, but also for society as a whole, massively beneficial. And I think when it comes to data in health and life sciences, we haven't even scratched the surface, not even close. I think we would all be shocked what type of transformation, what type of velocity, and ultimately care improvements we could see, even in just a decade, if we followed that template.
Yeah, so Dave is not watching now, but David Bronkart used to say, give me my damn data. I think in all these topics, when we talk about digitalization, we need data. We need the industry as well to open up. The European health data space is giving access to clinical data from our provider sides, but I missed the point in that European data space where the industry as well is opening data sets. We need open data sets on clinical trials so we can build large language models based on that to accelerate that work we're doing. Now I have 1,000 questions, 2 minutes and 40 seconds left. So I'm gonna close with the future. My experience is when I talk about open source, it's like, how am I gonna earn money? Because open source, they think that it's communism, which is absolutely not the case. If you look at software industries, that is absolutely not anything to do with communism. It's pure capitalism, and it accelerates based on shared R&D. So if you look into that future and based on the mRNA, perhaps example that you're giving, and you would open source more, where would value creation at the end happen? Are we still gonna patent and make things scarce, or where do you see the future of value in that new world that you create?
I mean, this comes back to what you're also doing at the moment in your most recent
with my stealth
stealth endeavors. But really, one way of thinking about this is again that you're starting to very directly reward velocity, speed of innovation, as opposed to effectively building up what largely will have to look like the same kind of infrastructure that everybody else also has to build up. So let me give you one example that we have actually started open sourcing. You can find it. It hasn't been announced properly yet. But one thing we realized is that when we talk to pharma partners, some of the more forward-looking properties and functions that we can design mRNAs for, they don't actually know how to assay reliably. And not only that, every pharma partner that we talk to has a different approach and is planning to use different readouts, different instruments, et cetera, et cetera. And they can't all be ideal or optimal. So one thing we've started to release are the validation assays to really validate and compare molecules that we design, but also molecules that others might design, molecules that the pharma partners themselves might design. So what do I expect us to gain from that? The same as everybody else, which is a level playing field to compete, a space where it doesn't matter anymore who has the better PowerPoint deck when it comes to how well your molecules land, or who has the better salespeople or the better business folks, but it matters how good the molecules are, and you can compare them head to head directly. Right? And that's just one example. The moment we will start to realize that data will be more and more common across organizations, right? I would say the first entity that actually releases a lot of that data and also templates for how to create more will actually be paid back in kind, because then people will be able to follow those templates, will be able to follow the same QC standards and actually generate additional data that they will probably also share, because they will see this happening, they will see the positive example and benefit everybody in the course of that.
And there is so much proof of that. If you look at just Mistral AI, which is an open source based French startup, in 1 year, they were on par with OpenAI GPT-4. There was a German AI startup with the same level of funding, 500 million, that closed and never reached that speed. So speed is everything in the future. And if you just want to think a bit as a kind of a play with what David said when Luther and the printing press came, imagine this. Imagine that the mindset that most of you have in terms of data and protecting data, if Gutenberg would have thought that way, and he would have patented the alphabet. And ask yourself, how many books would have been printed, would have been still being paying letter of indulgence, because we would never have seen the democratization of knowledge sharing and the advancements of humanity as a whole. So I wanted to give that with you, and I thank Jakob for being here.
Thank you.
I hope I'm invited again next year. Thank you for your attention, and
thank you.
We are here to take it.